Instead of making the ship faster, how about installing some seatbelts?
Seatbelts are dead weight. I feel the need for speed.
Yes, but I feel the nafety for safety.
Oh, fuff.
Okay, so let's do green to green. Finishing up the speaker wiring connections here.
Yeah. So we've got the factory amplifier output plug here, and this is the plug that goes into the factory wiring harness. And so we're just attaching the speaker outputs to go through the speaker wire.
So the idea is it makes a aftermarket stereo system electrically a plug-and-play affair.
And again, more living room work because, well, this can be done in a living room.
Yep.
Doesn't have to be done in a shop.
And it's cold outside and dark.
It is indeed.
Yeah, and just any good heat gun. And these are connectors that have a little bit of solder right there in the middle. And the heat gun melts the solder and solders the wires together, and the protective coating gets it all watertight.
And yes, they are using my grooming table, my indoor one. Not a big deal. It's a great height, and hey, it's a flat surface.
It's a table.
It's a table that works.
So yeah, rather than using a traditional connector, well, that cools for a second. These have a little bit of adhesive and a little bit of solder in the center. Normally, with a more traditional connector,
Yeah, they're. Here, show them this.
you have the crimp ring. You insert the wires and then crimp each side. With this, you get a solder connection instead of the crimp for the mechanical. Figure for the stereo, the solder connection might be just a little bit better for us electrically.
Yeah.
And they are proving to be a little bit cleaner.
Yeah.
There's a little less bulk to these.
What did you say? Bolt?
Bulk.
Bulk. Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, they're not quite as thick once they melt down.
Oh, I see. And what's the paper for?
The paper is actually our wiring diagram.
Oh, excellent.
We just happened to lay on top of it.
We actually sat down because of everything that's going on and mapped all of our wires ahead of time to make sure that we understood what went where.
Yeah, because there's a lot of wires.
Again, back in our living room, simply because it's 9 o'clock at night, it's cold outside, and
We really wanted to watch Holly and Marvin do the 24-hour to Hell and Back live. But we're pausing it real quick so that we can show you some of the wiring progress that we've been making. So Kenneth, tell us what you're doing.
Okay, so I am working through wiring the switch panel. A lot of people would do a Switch Pros or an S-Pod or something of that nature rather than dealing with what I am up to right now. But the idea here is this is an old school analog switch setup. And with these Carling switches, we have 5 connectors on the back, 2 of which, side by side, are grounds. So what I'm doing is working my way through building the wiring harness, or building the wiring that will be behind these switches, starting with running a ground. And the idea is I will come in off of a circuit to this panel, and I'm going to run a ground across all of the ground connectors on these switches. And so we start, at this USB port here, as it turns out, and then to the ground on the switch. Planning ahead for a switch that isn't in this position yet, but including the grounds on it.
It's actually my only blank.
Covering the next switch and the next switch. Now, in the interest of keeping things a little bit cleaner and also just sort of trying to reduce the total amount of connectors in a single run, we come off of this first switch and then jump up here to the top row and come across. And so I'm just working my way across, adding all of the jumpers for the grounds on this top row of switches. And it's just a case of, I cut a whole bunch of 2-inch or 2.5-inch chunks of wire. Each one gets stripped. I'm probably stripping a little bit more than I need to, but I'm connecting and twisting these wires as I go, so give myself just a little bit extra to work with. Twist the two wires together. And then crimp on the spade connector that goes to the back of the switch. Now, if I don't get these twisted clean, the spade doesn't want to go on. That's better. So get that on there, and then make sure I get my crimper oriented the right way, because otherwise it gets pushed off of these connectors. Crimp each one, check each one as it goes. And connect it to the switch. And it's kind of a lather, rinse, repeat. Now, one of the things that is kind of annoying in some ways is that each of these switches has two separate grounds. The idea is that one of those grounds is for the switch illumination when the switch is turned on. The other ground is for the switch illumination that is tied to your dash lights. And so when this is all said and done, there will be 3 of these harnesses that runs from switch to switch to switch to switch. One will be a power input for the switch. One will be a input for the dash lights. One will be for the ground. And then the last will be the, each one will have an individual wire that will go up to our relay box, which will support the actual devices. And that's important because we're not going to run all of the accessories that we're driving here off of this single circuit. This is only the triggers for the relay, and so the total amperage draw on this is going to be in the vicinity of about 2 to 3 amps total. And that's because each relay only draws about 200 milliamps, and then the LEDs that are behind the switches have a little bit of draw on their own. But it's still going to be well below the 15 amp circuit that I'm feeding in to run the USB accessory outlet. You'll note that I'm not connecting this to the second accessory outlet here. This will come off of a separate circuit in the vehicle that's independent of the rest of this. Again, using the 15 amp circuit to the USB, because the USB itself is only going to facilitate about 7 amps total current draw. So 7 amps for the USB plus, 3 or 4 amps for all of the relays and lights and everything else. We'll be well under that 15 amp total circuit capacity.
Lincoln was down here wiggling the camera, being a shop dog. Right, Link?
Working my way through the second harness, or the second one of these wires that runs across all of them. So same idea, starting from the USB port, running across the hot wire or basically the input for the switch. Same idea, run across the bottom with the extra terminal for the vacant switch up to the top, working my way across the upper row here. Now, these only have one connection per switch, whereas the grounds had two, so there's a lot fewer individual wires that have to be added for this one. Makes it a little bit easier to work with. You can see that I've actually pulled the other harness out. I've run these through the heat shrink. A little easier to work with from building it when there isn't the second set of wires in the middle of everything, but eventually this all has to be put together with all of the wires in place on all of the connectors. So again, just kind of a tedious, work your way through one at a time. I typically go in, figure out what length the connector or the wires from one switch to the next will be, and I cut them all the same length. It just makes it a little bit cleaner, a little bit prettier when it gets put together, when everything is close to the same, because it just kind of looks more consistent in the wiring. But again, just a kind of this tedious one wire to the next, to the next, to the next, and then check the whole thing when it's put together to make sure you've got continuity all the way through.
The shop dog didn't find it interesting. He crashed. But he had agility class tonight too, so he's tired.
So working through all this whole thing as we go. Now we've got all the switches in this wire done up. We want to make sure that the whole thing actually works and that we've got continuity all the way through. So just checking with my multimeter and verifying the last connector has no resistance. So I know that all of the crimps and connections all the way through are making contact. If I'm paranoid, I can come through and check each one. But generally, if the last one is good, all of the intermediate ones will be good as well, because it's really hard for the last one to have conductivity without having all of the others along the way. Okay, finishing up putting the switch panel together. It's looking decent from the front side. All the switches are here. On the back side, the various wiring groups are now installed. So we've got all of the orange wires here tying what is pin 6 on all of the switches. This is a nighttime illumination. You turn on the dash lights, it'll cause the backlight on the switches to light up. All the red wires that jump from starting with this USB port all the way through. This is on pin 2 of every switch, all tied together. That's the hot into the switch. And then the black wires that are the various grounds. And again, every switch has 2 grounds, one for the backlight illumination and one for the illumination when the switch is turned on. But it's the same idea, just a wire that jumps every ground on every switch together and pulls it off. Some vehicles may need a different ground for the dash illumination than from the switch. In our case, we don't need that, so again, just tie all the grounds together. So that leaves one pin, again there's 5 pins on the switch, that leaves one pin on every switch that is the output that will then go up to our relay pack under the hood. So this is basically ready to be installed, other than needing to connect an additional 10 wires for the outputs from the switches. When we get it into the TJ, these pigtails here will go to the accessory power connector. Now that's a factory connector that's on the TJ, and then the always on hot battery will come to this one, which is our typical cigarette lighter style 12 volt power outlet. So we retain that ability to use a regular 12 volt accessory, as well as being able to support the USB, more modern USB type devices, phones, chargers, things like that. These USB ports are obviously power only. There is no back-end connection. With our stereo, we do have another USB port we'll need to work out that is the one that actually connects to the stereo. So this is getting very close to being ready to be installed in the vehicle.
Thank you, Kenneth.